Number 10. Carlton Gary, Columbus, Georgia, 1977. A city that prided itself on Southern charm and close-knit neighborhoods suddenly found itself gripped by a terror no one could explain. Elderly women, respected, beloved pillars of the community, were being targeted inside their own homes. No forced entry, no signs of struggle at the door, just the chilling aftermath left behind for families to discover. Carlton Gary was charming, handsome, and completely unremarkable to look at. He worked odd jobs, moved through communities like smoke, and left almost nothing behind, except fear. Over the course of roughly 2 years, at least 7 women lost their lives. The killings sent Columbus into a lockdown of anxiety. Neighbors stopped visiting each other after dark. Women who had lived alone for decades suddenly couldn't sleep. The city aged overnight. What made the investigation so maddening was how little investigators had to work with. Gary seemed to vanish between crimes, surfacing in different states, living under different names. He was a ghost with a social security number. When he was finally arrested in 1984, nearly 7 years after the murders began, the relief in Columbus was palpable. But the trial, that was its own ordeal. Legal battles stretched across decades, appeals, reversals, questions about evidence handling and the reliability of the case built against him. Gary maintained his innocence until the very end, and some legal observers weren't entirely sure he was right to do so. He was executed in March 2018, more than 40 years after the first murder. Justice, if it was justice, arrived glacially slow. But one question has never fully been put to rest. Were all 7 murders truly his work? Or did investigators, desperate for answers, close the book on a case that may have had more than one author?
Number 9. Richard Allen. February 13, 2017, a Monday. 2 teenage girls, Abby Williams, 14, and Libby German, 13, set out for a hike along the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana. It was a quiet, postcard-perfect town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. By the next morning, both girls were found dead in the woods near Deer Creek. What followed would become one of the haunting, unsolved cases in American history, until it wasn't. What made this case unlike anything investigators had seen before was the evidence Libby left behind. Before she died, she managed to secretly record her phone's camera, capturing blurry footage of a man walking toward them on the bridge. His voice, his posture, his words. "Down the hill," he says, in a tone so chillingly calm it sent shivers across the country when law enforcement released the audio. For 5 years, that voice echoed through the internet. Millions of amateur sleuths, Reddit threads, and true crime communities obsessed over the footage. Who was this man? Investigators received thousands of tips. Suspects were named, cleared, named again. The town of Delphi lived under a shadow of fear and grief that refused to lift. Then, in October 2022, more than 5 years later, police arrested Richard Allen, a 50-year-old CVS pharmacy employee who lived in Delphi. He had been interviewed early in the investigation. He had attended community vigils for the girls. He was hiding in plain sight. The arrest cracked open a case the nation had nearly given up on, but it also cracked open new questions. Allen's trial was plagued by legal chaos, leaked documents, replaced defense attorneys, allegations of contaminated evidence, and a judge who became the center of controversy himself. When Allen was convicted in October 2024, some cheered, others weren't so sure. The evidence that broke the case? A rare bullet, an unspent round found near the crime scene, linked to a gun registered to Allen. And yet, the leaked defense documents had suggested something far darker and more complex lurking beneath the surface. A theory so bizarre it had to be sealed by court order. Abby and Libby got their verdict, but the full truth of what happened on that bridge in Delphi, Indiana? Some say we still don't have it.
Number 8. Cosmo DiNardo. It started with a missing persons report, then another, then 2 more. In July 2017, 4 young men vanished in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania, over the span of just a few days. Dean Finicario, 19, Mark Sturgis, 22, Tom Mio, 21, Jimmy Patrick, 19. 4 different young men, 4 different families, one terrifying connection. They had all been to a sprawling 90-acre farm owned by the DiNardo family in Soulbury Township. The man at the center of it all was Cosmo DiNardo, a 20-year-old with a history of mental illness and prior weapons charges. He was known in the community. He came from a wealthy, well-connected family, and behind the pastoral quiet of that Pennsylvania farm, he had committed acts so calculated and cold that prosecutors would call them executions. DiNardo lured each victim under the pretense of a drug deal. One by one, they came. One by one, they disappeared. Investigators searching the property made a discovery that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. A repurposed oil tank buried in the earth, used as a makeshift cremation device. The remains of 3 of the victims were found inside. The 4th was buried separately in a 12-foot grave dug by a backhoe. The community was devastated. These were boys next door, young men with whole lives ahead of them, undone in an instant by someone who smiled at his neighbors and attended family gatherings. DiNardo eventually confessed, but only after negotiating a deal to avoid the death penalty. He pointed investigators to the remains himself. His cousin, Shawn, was implicated as well, charged with participating in 3 of the murders. DiNardo was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will never leave prison. But something about this case still gnaws at those who followed it closely. The motive, a dispute over drug money, seemed almost too mundane for the level of premeditation involved. The buried tank, the backhoe, the planning. Was this really about a few $100s? Or was there something darker driving Cosmo DiNardo that the court never fully uncovered? Number 7. Joseph James DeAngelo. For 40 years, he was a ghost. Between 1974 and 1986, a man known by several terrifying names, the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, committed at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries across California. He was methodical, he was patient, he was invisible. His method was precise and deeply calculated. He would stalk neighborhoods for weeks before striking, learning routines, memorizing layouts. He would break into homes in the dead of night, binding victims with shoelaces he had pre-cut to specific lengths. He would whisper threats. He would leave. He would sometimes call his victims afterward, breathing on the line or leaving haunting messages. Law enforcement was baffled for decades. Composite sketches went nowhere. Witnesses described a young, athletic man. Evidence was collected, but sat matched in databases. The case went cold. Victims grew old. Some investigators never stopped working it. Then came the revolution, genetic genealogy. In April 2018, investigators submitted DNA from the crime scenes to a consumer genealogy database. They built a family tree from partial DNA matches. They traced bloodlines. They narrowed suspects.
and they landed on 72-year-old retired police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. Joseph James DeAngelo had been a cop. He had served the public. He had lived among the communities he terrorized. Investigators covertly collected DNA from items DeAngelo discarded, a car door handle, tissue from a trash can, and it matched. He was arrested in his driveway in April 2018 without a struggle. In court, DeAngelo stood and read statements of allocution to each of his victims by name, a legal requirement. The faces in that courtroom told the whole story. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But here is what haunts investigators still. DeAngelo was a trained law enforcement officer during the height of his crimes. He knew exactly how investigations worked. He knew what evidence to leave and what to take. And for 40 years, he was right.
Number 6. Charles Manson. The summer of 1969 was supposed to be the summer of peace. Woodstock, the moon landing, the last exhale of a decade defined by idealism and the belief that love could change the world. Then came the nights of August 8th and 9th. In the hills above Los Angeles, in a rented home on Cielo Drive, actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, and 4 others were slaughtered in an attack of almost unimaginable ferocity. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were killed the following night in their home across the city. The word helter-skelter was written on the walls in blood. Los Angeles shut down. The dream of the 60s didn't just end, it was murdered along with those victims. The investigation, led by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, became a landmark in American legal history. Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, became the best-selling true crime book of all time. The trial captivated the nation. Manson's followers showed up outside the courthouse with X's carved into their foreheads. When the death penalty was handed down, they seemed almost pleased. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017, aged 83, having never shown remorse. His followers, some of them, have since been released. They speak of deprogramming, of being lost, of a man who convinced them that the world needed to burn. What no one has ever fully explained is the mechanism of Manson's influence. How a man with no formal power, no money, and no weapons created an army of killers out of runaways and dropouts. Researchers and psychologists have studied it for 50 years. They still don't agree on the answer. Number 5. O.J. Simpson. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were found brutally killed outside her Brentwood, California condominium. Both had suffered multiple stab wounds. Nicole's 2 young children were asleep inside the home. The prime suspect was almost immediately her ex-husband, Orenthal James Simpson, O.J. Simpson, one of the most celebrated running backs in the NFL history, a television personality, an American icon. What followed was not just a trial. It was a cultural earthquake that exposed every fault line running beneath the surface of American life: race, celebrity, domestic violence, the justice system, and the power of wealth. The evidence against Simpson was substantial: blood at the crime scene matching his DNA, a bloody glove found at his estate, a history of documented domestic violence against Nicole. Prosecutors built what many legal analysts considered an airtight case, but the defense, led by Johnny Cochran, transformed the trial into something else entirely. The revelation that lead detective Mark Furman had used racial slurs on tape reframed the entire case for a jury that was majority black in a city still raw from the Rodney King verdict in the 1992 riots.
Cochran's iconic line, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," referring to a glove demonstration gone wrong, became one of the most quoted phrases in American legal history. On October 3, 1995, after nearly 9 months of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Not guilty. The reactions split the country in two, literally. Footage of Black Americans cheering the verdict and white Americans weeping played side by side on every network. The divide was not about O.J. Simpson. It never really was. In 1997, a civil jury found Simpson liable for the deaths and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages to the families, a verdict he largely evaded through legal maneuvering. O.J. Simpson died in April 2024. He never confessed. He never stood trial for murder again. Ron Goldman's father, Fred, has never stopped seeking justice. He never got it. The question that has haunted America for 30 years is one the legal system never answered, not officially, not finally. And that question is the same one it has always been.
Number 4. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. April 20th, 1999, Littleton, Colorado. 11:19 in the morning. Two seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, walked into Columbine High School carrying firearms and homemade explosive devices. What happened over the next 49 minutes changed America permanently. 12 students and 1 teacher were killed. 24 others were injured. And then, in the school library, the room where most of the carnage occurred, both Harris and Klebold took their own lives. It was not the first school shooting in American history, but it was the one that redefined the term entirely. The images that emerged, students fleeing with their hands above their heads, a girl crying on a hillside, police officers crouched behind cars, became the defining visual language of a new American fear. Every school in the country changed after Columbine. Lockdown drills, security cameras, active shooter protocols. A generation of children grew up learning to barricade classroom doors. What made Columbine so deeply disturbing, beyond the horror of the act itself, was the aftermath of understanding. Investigators, journalists, and psychologists spent years dismantling every assumption. The bullied loner narrative, largely a myth. Harris, researchers concluded, displayed textbook psychopathic traits, charismatic, controlled, and contemptuous of humanity. Klebold, by contrast, was deeply depressed and in many ways led. Journals, videos, and writings left behind by both young men painted a portrait of 2 boys hiding in plain sight, who had planned the attack for over a year, who had told almost no one, and who had hoped the body count would exceed that of the Oklahoma City bombing. Parents, teachers, and classmates were interviewed years afterward, searching for the signs they missed. The community of Littleton has never fully healed. Some survivors speak publicly, others never have. And here is something most people don't know. Harris and Klebold's original plan involved bombs, not guns. They had planted propane bombs in the cafeteria designed to kill hundreds. Those bombs failed to detonate. Had they worked, Columbine would have been one of the deadliest attacks on American soil in history. They failed because of a wiring error. Number 3. Scott Peterson. Christmas Eve, 2002. Modesto, California. Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant, radiant, and days away from welcoming her first child, vanished without a trace. Her husband, Scott Peterson, told police he had spent the day on a solo fishing trip at the San Francisco Bay. He came home, he said, to an empty house and a missing wife. The nation held its breath. Lacey's disappearance triggered one of the largest volunteer search efforts in California history. Thousands of people canvassed neighborhoods, distributed flyers, and prayed for her safe return. Her mother appeared on television, tearfully pleading for information. Her face was everywhere. Scott Peterson stood beside his family at press conferences, expressing grief that some found eerily controlled. He gave interviews. He cooperated, to a point. But investigators noticed the cracks almost immediately. His behavior was inconsistent. His timeline had gaps. And then came the revelation that detonated the case wide open. Scott Peterson had a mistress, a massage therapist named Amber Frey. He had told her he was a widower. He had been seeing her before Lacey disappeared. When Frey came forward to investigators, she agreed to record her phone calls with Scott. Those recordings, played in court and broadcast to a stunned public, captured a man making romantic plans and attending New Year's Eve parties while his pregnant wife was missing. In April 2003, the case broke wide open in the most devastating way possible. The partial remains of a full-term baby boy washed ashore in the San Francisco Bay. Days later, Lacey's body followed, badly decomposed but identifiable. Both had surfaced near the exact location where Scott claimed he had been fishing on Christmas Eve. The trial was a national spectacle. Amber Frey testified. The recordings played. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. In 2021, his sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole following a California Supreme Court ruling related to jury selection. He has maintained his innocence through every appeal, every interview, and every petition. But here is what no one has ever been able to explain away. Of all the waters in California, hundreds of miles of coastline and reservoirs, Lacey and Connor washed ashore within a mile of where Scott said he went fishing that day. Coincidence, his supporters say. The jury didn't think so.
Number 2. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. A young man named Matthew Shepard, 21 years old, a University of Wyoming student with a gentle disposition and a passion for politics and human rights, met two men at a local bar. Their names were Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. They offered him a ride home. Matthew Shepard never made it home. 18 hours later, a cyclist on a rural road outside Laramie noticed what appeared to be a scarecrow tied to a split-rail fence in an open field. He stopped. It was Matthew. He was barely alive, beaten so severely that doctors at the trauma center were unable to fully assess the extent of his injuries beneath the blood. He had been pistol-whipped, robbed, and left tied to that fence through a cold October night in a position that witnesses described as almost cruciform. He died 5 days later, on October 12, 1998, without ever regaining consciousness. The nation grieved, but the grief was tangled with rage because Matthew Shepard was gay, and investigators quickly established that his sexual orientation had been central to the motivation behind the attack. McKinney and Henderson had targeted him, lured him, and beaten him because of who he was. The case became the most visible and consequential hate crime in modern American history. Candlelight vigils erupted across the country and around the world. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed outside the courthouse. The Westboro Baptist Church picketed Matthew's funeral with signs so vile that volunteers formed a human wall, what became known as the Angel Action, to shield his family from the hatred. McKinney and Henderson were convicted of felony murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms each, avoiding the death penalty only because Matthew's mother, Judy Shepard, personally asked the court for mercy, saying Matthew would not have wanted more violence in his name. Judy Shepard transformed her grief into a lifelong mission. The Matthew Shepard Foundation became a cornerstone of LGBTQ+ advocacy. In 2009, 11 years after her son's death, President Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act into federal law. She was in the room when he signed it. But the case has a haunting postscript that has never been fully resolved. In 2013, a journalist published a book claiming the murder was primarily motivated by drugs and robbery, not hatred, suggesting McKinney and Shepard had known each other previously. The claim was disputed fiercely by investigators, prosecutors, and Judy Shepard herself. McKinney, behind bars, has given conflicting accounts across the years. The law that bears Matthew's name exists. The debate about what truly happened that night and why has never fully closed. A young man tied to a fence in Wyoming changed the legal landscape of an entire country. And the two men who put him there are still alive, in prison, with decades left to serve.
Number 1. John William King, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and Shawn Berry. James Byrd Jr. was 49 years old, a beloved father of 3, known in his small East Texas community for his warm laugh and generous spirit. On a quiet Sunday night, he accepted a ride from 3 men he knew casually from around town. Their names were John William King, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and Shawn Berry. What those 3 men did next would reverberate across America like a thunderclap and force the nation to confront the reality that the ugliest chapters of its racial history were not as buried as many wanted to believe. King and Brewer were white supremacists, heavily tattooed with Aryan Brotherhood imagery, radicalized during prison sentences they had served together. That night, on a remote logging road outside Jasper, they beat James Byrd severely, chained him by his ankles to the back of their pickup truck, and dragged him for nearly 3 miles along an asphalt road. The medical examiner's report told the story with devastating precision. James Byrd was alive for much of the ordeal. He died when his body struck a culvert. His remains were found scattered across approximately 2 miles of road. His head was found a significant distance from the rest of his body. The town of Jasper was shattered. Jasper was not a town with a history of racial violence. Neighbors of different races had coexisted there for generations. The brutality of what had been done to James Byrd on that road felt like a message aimed not just at one man, but an entire community, an entire country. All 3 men were convicted. Shawn Berry, who prosecutors argued was the least ideologically motivated, received life in prison. Lawrence Russell Brewer was executed by lethal injection in September 2011. John William King was executed in April 2019. On the night of his execution, King reportedly showed no remorse. James Byrd's murder, alongside Matthew Shepard's death 4 months later, directly led to federal hate crimes legislation signed by President Obama in 2009. His daughter, Renee Mullins, has spent decades advocating for racial justice in her father's name. She witnessed the execution of John William King. Afterward, she said she felt no joy, only the long, quiet weight of a grief that legislation and verdicts and executions can acknowledge but never erase. James Byrd Jr. was walking home that night. He was 50 yards from his front door when he accepted that ride.